She thought it was food, one bite of a wild mushroom in the winter forest, and her mind began to break. Hallucinations took over. The cold closed in. She ran deeper into the woods, chasing voices that weren't real. As her body shut down, one man heard her screams, a retired Navy SEAL who could have walked away. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter presses Spokane into silence, snow-muted streets thinning into forest, daylight dim and colorless. Cold settles early, patient and absolute, as if the land itself is holding its breath. Michael Carter had learned to live inside that held breath. He did not think of himself as lonely. Loneliness implied a lack, and Michael had chosen this life with intention. The cabin at the city's edge was small, practical, and quiet in a way cities never were. Silence here was not empty. It was disciplined. It stayed where you put it. It obeyed. Most mornings Michael woke before dawn, not because he wanted to, but because his body had not learned the difference between peace and vigilance. Sleep came in fragments, thin as frost. When it broke, he lay still and listened, counting seconds, measuring the wind, letting the present prove itself safe. Today was no different. He brewed coffee he barely tasted and stood by the window until the sky shifted from black to slate. The German Shepherd rose when he did, no command needed. The dog moved with the quiet certainty of something that understood routine as survival. Not eager, not restless, ready. Michael pulled on a jacket and stepped outside. The cold reached for him immediately, sharp and familiar. He welcomed it. Cold was honest. It did not pretend to be anything else. They walked the tree line together, boots crunching softly, paws leaving a clean pattern beside them. Michael let his thoughts drift, not backward, not forward, just loose enough to breathe. The city was close enough that sirens sometimes reached him, distant and abstract, like stories that belonged to someone else. Out here the world narrowed to what mattered: ground, air, time. He had not planned to go far, just enough to keep his legs from stiffening, his mind from circling the same old memories like wolves around a campfire. Movement kept the noise down. The dog paused first. It was subtle, a shift in posture, a stillness that wasn't relaxation. Michael felt it a second later, the way you feel pressure change before a storm. He stopped. The forest waited. At first, the sound didn't make sense. It arrived broken, incomplete, as if it had been dropped and shattered on the way to him. A breathy laugh, thin and unmoored, followed by a sob that cut short. Michael's chest tightened. Laughter had rules. So did crying. This had neither. He scanned the trees, eyes tracing familiar lines now, made strange by snow. The sound came again, closer this time, a voice maybe, or something pretending to be one. The dog did not bark. That alone told Michael everything. Barking was for warnings. This was different. The shepherd stepped forward, placing itself half a pace ahead, not aggressive, not afraid. Guarding. Michael felt the old calculations begin, the ones he'd sworn he was done with. Distance, direction, risk. He hated how quickly they returned, how easily the past slid back into place like a weapon into a practiced hand. You don't owe the world anything, he told himself. He had earned the right to walk away. But another sound rose from the trees, rawer now, edged with panic. Whatever had been laughing was no longer amused. Michael closed his eyes for half a second. He remembered other voices like that. Different languages, different places, the same note of unraveling, the sound a person makes when the mind lets go before the body does. He exhaled and turned toward it. The forest thickened quickly. Snow clung to branches, dragging them low, narrowing sight lines. Michael moved carefully, placing each step with deliberate restraint. The dog matched him, silent and intent, nose lifting and lowering as if tasting the air. As they pushed deeper, the voice grew clearer and worse. Don't come closer," it said, then laughed again, sharp and startled, as if the words had surprised her. Michael stopped at the edge of a small clearing. She stood there, swaying, hands raised as though warding off something only she could see. Young, that much was obvious. Too lightly dressed for the cold, breath coming fast and uneven. Her eyes slid past him without recognition. Michael did not move. He knew better than to rush a moment like this. He had seen what panic did when cornered. "It's okay," he said, keeping his voice low, steady. He shaped the words carefully, as if they might break. "I'm not here to hurt you." She turned sharply, scanning the trees, eyes wide. "You hear it too?" she whispered. Michael felt something settle heavily behind his ribs. The dog sat, unprompted, body angled toward her, ears forward. Not a challenge. An anchor. "What do you hear?" Michael asked. She frowned, confusion sliding across her face like a shadow. "The fire," she said, then shook her head hard. No, that's not right. There isn't any fire, I know that." Her hands trembled. She hugged herself, teeth chattering, though Michael suspected it wasn't from the cold. This wasn't simple fear. It wasn't intoxication the way most people meant it. Michael recognized the pattern now, the fractured attention, the certainty of things that weren't there, the way her body argued with her own thoughts. Poison, his mind supplied calmly. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. Michael took a slow step forward. The shepherd rose with him, matching the movement precisely. She recoiled. "Stop! You can't," he said. "I couldn't let anyone follow." "Who said that?" Michael asked. She opened her mouth, then hesitated. The question seemed to pull her in two directions at once. Her certainty wavered, and for a moment, fear broke through the confusion. "I don't know," she said, almost pleading. That was the moment Michael knew he was already too far in to leave. He felt the familiar weight settle onto his shoulders, not fear, not heroism. Responsibility, the kind that didn't ask permission. He did not think about what this would cost him. He never did in moments like these. Thinking about cost came later, when there was time and quiet and consequences. For now there was only a young woman unraveling in the snow, a forest that did not care, and a choice that had already been made. Michael lowered himself slowly to one knee, making himself smaller, less threatening. The dog stayed close, a steady presence at his side. "Listen to me," Michael said, and his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had learned the value of being heard. "You're not alone. You're not in trouble. We're going to get you somewhere warm." She stared at him, eyes searching, trying to fit his words into a world that no longer followed rules. The forest listened, and somewhere beneath the snow, time kept moving, indifferent, relentless, waiting to see whether Michael Carter would manage to stay ahead of it. Snow thickens beneath the trees as daylight thins, turning the forest into a narrow corridor of white and shadow where sound travels strangely and direction becomes a suggestion rather than a rule. Michael Carter stayed where he was, letting the quiet do its work. He kept his breathing slow and visible, hands open, posture lowered, everything about him designed to signal absence of threat. It felt backward, almost absurd, to use de-escalation tactics on a frightened civilian after a life spent rehearsing the opposite, but instinct had learned new shapes since he left the teams. The girl's eyes kept sliding past him, tracking movement that did not exist, her attention snapping and breaking like brittle ice. He recognized the pattern with a dull certainty that settled behind his sternum. This was not fear alone. Fear sharpened focus. This scattered it. He measured the space between them and felt the dog's presence steady at his side, a familiar weight that grounded him more than the cold ever could. The dog's thoughts were simple and fierce in the way of creatures forged for work. Stay, watch, hold the line. Michael let that steadiness seep into his own chest. He spoke again, keeping his sentences short, rhythmic, the way he had once spoken to men whose minds were slipping under blast shock and exhaustion. "You're cold. We're going to fix that, one step at a time." She flinched as if the words had touched her skin. "I can't stop," she said, voice thin and quick. "If I stop, they'll catch me." The plural lodged itself in Michael's mind. People invented pursuers when their brains were under siege. He did not ask who they were. He asked where she had come from, a question anchored in geography rather than imagination. She pointed, then shook her head, then laughed sharply as if the answer had betrayed her. Michael felt the old urge to take control rise like a tide, the reflex to seize and command, to force order onto chaos. He resisted it. Force would turn her fear into a weapon against herself. He needed consent, or something close enough to it. The dog shifted, stepping half a pace closer to her, not crowding, simply existing in her peripheral vision like a promise that did not demand explanation. Her breathing hitched, then slowed a fraction. Michael filed that away. Anchors mattered. He scanned the ground while he spoke, eyes moving without appearing to. Snow was thin here, disturbed. Beneath it, he saw the ragged edges of caps crushed under boots, the telltale smear where someone had slipped and steadied themselves with a hand. He did not touch anything yet. Touching would come later, when he had the luxury of time. For now, he needed her upright and responsive. "What did you eat today?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. She frowned, the question slicing through the fog for a heartbeat. "I wasn't hungry," she said. "I found something. It looked clean." The word clean struck him harder than it should have. He thought of the winter mushrooms he had learned to avoid decades ago during a training exercise that had gone wrong in another forest, another life. He remembered the vomiting, the delirium, the way one of the instructors had laughed it off until his hands started to shake. Michael swallowed and nodded, as if she had told him nothing unusual. "Okay," he said. "We'll figure that out later." She took a step back, then another, drawn by a sound only she could hear. Michael mirrored her movement without closing the distance, letting her feel followed without being chased. The dog moved with them, a quiet triangle of motion that kept her from bolting. Michael's thoughts threaded backward despite his efforts. He remembered a night overseas when a local interpreter had wandered into a minefield because he was convinced his brother was calling him. Michael had shouted until his throat bled. He had watched helplessly as belief overrode caution. The memory tightened his jaw. He would not watch that happen again if he could help it. The girl's hands began to tremble more violently, fingers clawing at the air as if it might hold her up. "It's getting louder," she whispered. Michael crouched, making himself smaller again, placing his weight through his heels so the snow would not crunch and startle her. "Listen to me," he said, and felt the authority return, not loud, not sharp, but unmistakable. "Look at the dog, stay with the dog." The dog sat patient, eyes forward, a living metronome. The girl's gaze snagged on it and held. Michael saw the momentary relief and used it. He slid his jacket from his shoulders and draped it around her without touching skin, a gesture that said warmth without restraint. She startled, then clutched the fabric like a lifeline. Her teeth chattered. He checked her pupils with a glance and felt his stomach sink. They were blown wide, unresponsive to the dim light. The poison was not just present, it was advancing. He needed to move her, but moving her meant provoking the forest and the visions both. He tested a step, then another, keeping his voice going, a low current beneath her panic. "We're going to sit for a minute," he said, though he knew they could not afford minutes. He needed her body to believe the lie long enough for her mind to follow. The dog lay down, shoulder brushing her leg, a contact that was not a grip. Her breathing slowed again. Michael let himself feel the relief and immediately tamped it down. Relief made you sloppy. He scanned the tree line and the slope beyond it, calculating routes that would keep them away from cliffs and ravines. The cold was deepening, a fact his bones understood better than any clock. He thought about how long it would take for hypothermia to complicate what was already complicated, how poison and cold loved each other the way bad ideas did. He thought about the city a few miles away, lights burning uselessly bright, while this patch of wood swallowed a life without noticing. He wondered, not for the first time, when he had stopped believing that help would arrive on its own. The girl's eyes flicked back to him, suddenly lucid, fear replaced by a sharp, piercing clarity. "You have to go," she said urgently. "They don't like you." Michael met her gaze and felt the weight of every uniform he had worn, every choice he had made that put him on one side of a line or another. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. The clarity fractured. She sagged forward, the strength draining out of her as if someone had pulled a plug. Michael moved then, fast and decisive, catching her before she hit the snow, easing her down with a care that bordered on reverence. The dog pressed closer, a silent barrier against the world. Michael's pulse hammered in his ears. He felt the moment shift, the balance tipping. This was no longer about keeping her calm, this was about keeping her alive. He glanced back toward the disturbed patch of ground and the crushed caps beneath the snow, then toward the darkening trees ahead. He did not know yet how far he would have to go or who he would have to confront to get her help. He only knew that time had begun to move faster, and it was not on their side. Winter tightens its grip as afternoon collapses into early dusk, the forest darkening by degrees while cold settles deeper, turning every decision into a negotiation with time and every step into a question of balance. Michael Carter adjusted his stance and felt the familiar protest flare along old injuries as he lifted the girl carefully, not all at once, not the way adrenaline demanded, but the way experience insisted, slow and deliberate, keeping her head aligned, her airway clear, her body supported as if it were something fragile he had been trusted to borrow rather than own. He did not think of heroics. He thought of angles and gravity and the simple truth that bodies failed when you asked too much of them too quickly. The girl's weight was not heavy, not by any objective measure, but it carried an urgency that made it feel denser than it was, a reminder that time itself could press down like a hand. She murmured as he shifted her, words slipping free without anchors, fragments of memories and fears braided together by the poison moving quietly through her system. Michael did not try to correct her. He had learned long ago that arguing with a mind under siege only strengthened the siege. He spoke instead about concrete things, the slope ahead, the sound of his boots, the cold air filling lungs that still worked. He narrated reality the way you do for someone learning to walk again, one fact at a time. The dog moved behind them, then ahead, then behind again, a patient orbit, its attention fixed not on the girl, but on the world around them, tracking threats that Michael could not afford to watch for while his focus narrowed to keeping them upright. Michael felt the animal's trust like a tether, a silent agreement forged long before words were necessary. "I will guard the edges if you guard the center." He began to move downslope, choosing a path that avoided the steepest drop-offs, testing each foothold before committing weight. The forest responded with indifference. Snow hid rocks, softened edges, lied about depth. He felt the old familiar tightening in his chest, not panic, not fear, but the sharp clarity that arrived when margins thinned. He remembered carrying men who outweighed him in worse places under worse conditions, remembered the discipline of breath and the way pain became background noise when purpose took the foreground. This was different, he told himself, and immediately corrected it. It was not different. It was the same equation with different variables. The girl stirred, her head lolling briefly, and Michael adjusted, feeling the heat of her skin through layers that were no match for the cold. Hypothermia would complicate everything. He increased his pace by a fraction, then steadied it again when her breathing hitched. Too fast, and she would panic. Too slow, and the poison would buy itself more time. He chose the middle, the place where compromise lived. The dog paused at a bend, ears angled forward, then turned to look at Michael as if asking permission to lead. Michael nodded without thinking. They had done this dance before. The trail narrowed, trees crowding closer, the ground sloping more sharply than Michael liked. He shifted his grip, felt his lower back protest, acknowledged the pain, and moved on. Pain was information, not instruction. The girl's hands clutched at his jacket, then relaxed, then clenched again, a rhythm that mirrored the battle unfolding inside her. She whispered a name that was not his. He let it pass. He spoke her name instead, the one she had given him earlier, repeating it softly until it seemed to reach something solid beneath the fog. For a few steps, her breathing evened, and Michael felt a flicker of relief that he immediately tamped down. Relief made you careless. The dog slowed suddenly, body angling to block a narrow spur of ground that fell away into shadow. Michael stopped, heart thudding, and followed the line of the animal's attention. A ravine cut through the trees ahead, partially concealed by snow-laden branches, the kind of place that offered no second chances. Michael rerouted without hesitation, choosing the longer path that skirted the edge, trading speed for certainty. He felt the calculation land and stay. He had made choices like this his entire adult life, choosing the path that kept people breathing even when it cost him time, sleep, blood. The girl stirred again, this time with more force, her body tensing as if she had decided to flee, even while held. "Let me go," she said, voice sharp with sudden conviction. "I can see it now. It's right there." Michael tightened his hold just enough to keep her from pitching forward, careful not to restrain more than necessary. "There's nothing there," he said, not unkindly, not dismissive, just firm. "You're seeing something your body made. It will pass." She laughed then, a brittle sound that cracked in the cold. "That's what they said last time." The words landed hard, a hint of a past Michael did not have time to unpack. He filed it away with everything else he could not afford to think about, yet. The dog pressed closer, flank brushing the girl's leg, a steady warmth and presence that cut through her agitation better than words ever could. Michael felt gratitude surge unexpectedly, sharp and grounding. He wondered, not for the first time, how much of himself he had managed to keep intact because of that quiet loyalty at his side. The light dimmed another notch, the forest drawing in on itself as if preparing for night. Michael adjusted his course again, angling toward where the land dipped more gently, toward where the city's edge might begin to fray into roads and fences and the possibility of help. He did not think about police or hospitals yet. Those thoughts were too big, too far ahead. He focused instead on the next 10 steps, then the 10 after that. The girl's breathing grew shallow, then steadied, then faltered again, an uneven metronome ticking away his margin. He murmured to her about warmth, about sitting soon, about rest that was not sleep. He knew the difference mattered. The dog glanced back repeatedly, eyes bright, alert, urging forward movement without haste. Michael listened. His legs burned now, the ache deep and insistent, and he welcomed it. Burning meant blood, meant movement, meant life. He felt the old discipline settle fully into place, the one that said you could do more than you believed if you did not waste energy believing you could not. As the trees thinned slightly ahead and the ground leveled, Michael allowed himself a single thought beyond the present. If he could just get her out of the forest before night sealed it shut, everything else would be a problem he was willing to face. Behind that thought came another, quieter and more dangerous. That the forest was not done with them yet, and that the next test would not be gentle. He tightened his grip, nodded once to the dog, and stepped forward into the narrowing light, unaware that the ground ahead would soon force a decision he could not delay. Dusk sinks fast in the Spokane woods, snow dulling sound while shadows lengthen into shapes that invite mistakes, the cold sharpening as daylight thins to a fragile margin. Michael Carter felt the shift before it happened, the subtle change in the girl's weight and tension that signaled a surge, the poison tightening its grip and steering her towards certainty, built from nothing. Her breathing accelerated, shallow and erratic, and the calm he had been constructing with words and rhythm fractured without warning. She stiffened in his arms, then twisted, a sudden strength flaring from panic, and Michael's heart kicked hard against his ribs as he understood what the poison was doing now. It was not just scattering her thoughts, it was giving her purpose, a false clarity that felt like escape. "There," she said, voice bright with conviction, pointing toward a darker stand of trees where the ground dropped away. Michael followed the line of her gaze and saw only danger disguised as promise. He adjusted his hold instinctively, but she bucked again, momentum and gravity conspiring, and for a split second the future narrowed to a single, terrible image of her breaking free and vanishing into the dark. He did not think. He reacted, planting his foot, shifting his center of mass, turning his body so that if one of them went down, it would be him. The snow betrayed them anyway, sliding underfoot, and they stumbled together, a brief, weightless moment where the forest seemed to inhale. The dog surged forward without command, placing itself squarely in her path, not baring teeth, not threatening, simply existing as an immovable fact. The girl collided with that presence and froze, confusion flashing across her face as if reality had reasserted itself through fur and breath rather than logic. Michael wrapped an arm across her chest from behind, careful, controlled, absorbing the impact as they fell sideways into the snow. Pain lanced through his hip and lower back, bright and immediate, but he welcomed it because pain was real and reality mattered more than comfort. They lay there for a second, breath steaming, the forest holding still around them as if waiting to see what would happen next. Michael spoke her name again, quietly, steadily, feeling the tremor in his voice and forcing it down. He did not tell her to calm down. He told her to feel the cold, to listen to the sound of her own breath, to look at the dog. He counted aloud, not because numbers had magic, but because counting was structure, and structure was something the poison could not erase all at once. She cried then, a thin, keening sound that cut through him more deeply than fear had. He held her there, not restraining, not releasing, occupying the narrow space between safety and harm. When her body finally sagged, the fight draining out of it, as abruptly as it had arrived, Michael let himself exhale. He checked her airway with a practiced touch, felt the tremor in her muscles, the heat of her skin gone uneven and wrong. Hypothermia was no longer a distant concern. It was stepping closer, hand in hand with the poison. Michael pushed himself upright, ignoring the protest from joints that had already given him their warning. He shifted her again, repositioning to distribute weight more evenly, knowing the next stretch would demand everything he had left. The dog stayed close, flank pressed to her side, a quiet sentinel that did not question the cost. Michael looked toward the drop she had almost chosen and felt a cold anger coil in his gut, not at her, not even at the poison, but at the way the world made cliffs look like answers when minds were tired enough. He turned away from it deliberately, choosing the longer path again, the one that curved toward the thinning trees and the possibility of human edges. As he moved, the girl's words returned in fragments, less vivid now, more slurred, and that frightened him more than her panic had. Panic burned hot and fast. This felt like the fire going out. He adjusted his pace, pushing harder despite the pain, then easing back when her breathing faltered. The dog set the tempo, a steady forward pull that kept Michael from hesitating too long in his calculations. He thought briefly of the men he had lost to cliffs like this, to moments where a single misjudgment had erased years of discipline, and he felt the old vow rise unbidden. Not today. The light continued to fail, the forest closing ranks, and Michael knew that if another surge came, it might be worse. He knew, too, that the next boundary they crossed would not be natural. Somewhere ahead were roads and people and uniforms and rules, and he did not yet know which of those would help and which would hinder. He tightened his grip, nodded once to the dog as if sealing an agreement, and pressed on, aware that the edge he had just pulled her back from was only the first, and that the next would demand a different kind of courage. Night presses closer as the temperature drops, the forest growing heavier and more insistent, each breath crystallizing in the air while the snow begins to steal heat faster than effort can replace it. Michael Carter felt the change in the girl before he saw it, a subtle slackening that frightened him more than her earlier panic had. Panic meant fight. This was different. This was the body turning inward, systems beginning to conserve, to shut doors one by one without asking permission. Her breathing slowed, then skipped, then settled into a shallow rhythm that felt borrowed rather than owned. He stopped long enough to read her face, to press 2 fingers lightly where a pulse should argue for life. It was there, but weaker than it had been minutes ago. Poison did not always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it simply waited until you were tired enough to stop arguing. Michael tightened his jaw and pushed the thought away. Fear wasted energy. He adjusted his grip again, rolling his shoulders to redistribute the weight, aware that his own strength was no longer something he could take for granted. He had spent years teaching himself not to notice pain, but this was not pain. It was fatigue, deep and structural, the kind that whispered about limits you could not negotiate with. He reminded himself that limits moved when you moved them, just not for free. The girl stirred, eyelids fluttering, a low sound escaping her throat that might have been a word once. Michael leaned closer, keeping his voice steady, factual, a tether to something solid. He told her they were still moving, told her the dog was right there, told her the cold was temporary, even as it gnawed at his own hands. He did not tell her to sleep. Sleep was dangerous now. The dog matched his pace, closer than before, body angled to block the wind where it could, attention split between the girl and the darkness around them. Michael sensed the animal's unease, not fear but urgency, the instinctive understanding that something fragile was being lost minute by minute. He used that urgency to keep himself moving when his legs began to shake. He tested the ground ahead with the toe of his boot, chose a path that curved gently upward rather than down, trading distance for safety again. He hated how often he was choosing longer routes tonight. He hated how familiar the calculus felt. The girl's head lolled against his shoulder, and he corrected gently, mindful of airway, of blood flow, of things that mattered more than speed, if speed cost them everything. He felt the cold seeping through his jacket now, dulling his fingers, creeping up his forearms, and he knew hypothermia would soon join the poison as a collaborator. He thought briefly about stopping, about building a shelter, about waiting it out, and dismissed it just as quickly. Waiting was a gamble stacked against them. Poison loved stillness. He kept moving. The forest began to thin in places, not enough to offer relief, but enough to hint at edges, at human boundaries beyond the trees. Michael latched onto that hint and let it pull him forward. He adjusted the girl's weight again and felt a tremor run through his arms. His breath rasped now, each inhale scraping cold air across lungs that had been through worse, but not tonight, not like this. He focused on cadence, on making each step match the last, on letting momentum do what willpower could not. The girl's breathing faltered again, a pause too long, then a gasp that snapped Michael's attention tight. He stopped, lowering her carefully to the snow, shielding her from the ground with his own body as he checked her airway, her chest, the rise and fall that felt more like an idea than a fact. He spoke her name sharply, not unkindly, and felt relief spike when her eyes opened a fraction. Confusion filled them, the sharp edges of hallucination dulled now into something more dangerous. "It's cold," she whispered, as if surprised by the discovery. "I know," Michael said. "Stay with me." He wrapped his jacket tighter around her, then added what warmth he could with his own body, acutely aware of how little either of them had left to give. The dog pressed in close, a steady, wordless presence that seemed to remind the world that this girl still belonged to it. Michael waited just long enough to see her breathing stabilize, then lifted her again, slower this time, every movement deliberate. His muscles protested loudly now, the earlier burn replaced by a deep, aching resistance that felt like a warning and a dare all at once. He accepted it and moved anyway. The snow began to change underfoot, packed more firmly, marked faintly by old tracks half erased by weather. Michael felt a flicker of hope he did not allow himself to trust. Hope made promises it could not always keep. He followed the tracks regardless, letting evidence guide him instead of optimism. The girl's weight shifted, and he compensated, feeling a sharp twinge in his side that stole his breath for a second. He paused, leaned into it, waited for the pain to settle into something manageable, then continued. The dog glanced back at him, eyes bright, urging without impatience. Michael nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that he was still in this, that quitting was not an option being entertained. He thought about the moment earlier when she had nearly gone over the edge and felt a cold echo of that fear tighten his chest again. He told himself that fear was useful only if it sharpened action, not if it froze it. Ahead, the trees opened just enough for him to glimpse a faint break in the snow, a line that might have been nothing, might have been everything. He angled toward it, feeling the ground level slightly, feeling the subtle shift that told him they were closer to something other than wilderness. The girl's breathing grew uneven again, her body slackening in a way that set off every alarm he had. Michael leaned close to her ear, voice firm, carrying the weight of command without the volume. "Stay awake," he said, "just for me." Her fingers twitched weakly against his jacket, a response so small it might have been coincidence, but Michael took it anyway, clung to it as proof that he was not too late yet. As he stepped forward again, following the faint line ahead, he felt the forest recede just enough to reveal the next truth waiting for them. Getting out of the woods would not end this fight, it would only change its shape. He did not yet know who would meet him on the other side, or what assumptions they would make when they saw a man carrying a barely conscious young woman out of the snow. He knew only that the poison was still moving, quietly, patiently, and that the next few minutes would decide whether it finished its work or was interrupted. Snow thins near the forest's edge where trees give way to a service road, sodium lights bleeding weak orange into the cold as night settles fully and the air sharpens with exhaust and ice. Michael Carter stepped out of the trees carrying the girl like something borrowed from a fire, precious and already cooling, his breath rasping as he crossed the last stretch of packed snow toward the road where a patrol car idled, engine ticking, lights washing the scene in indifferent color. He felt the shift immediately, the way space changed when uniforms entered it, how rules thickened the air and assumptions lined up before words ever did. The girl stirred against his shoulder, a small sound tearing loose from her throat, and Michael tightened his hold, not from fear of her falling, but from the knowledge that every eye would read that sound the wrong way. The German shepherd emerged a half-step behind, posture alert but contained, reading the humans with a clarity Michael envied. Two officers stood by the car, their conversation trailing off as they took in the picture piece by piece. A man out of the woods at night, a young woman barely conscious in his arms, a dog too close for comfort. Michael felt the old pressure build behind his eyes, the familiar urge to over-explain, to give the whole story before anyone asked. He did not indulge it. He named the problem instead. He said the words he had learned mattered most: poison, hypothermia, hallucinations, urgent care. One of the officers laughed softly, a sound that cut worse than disbelief. The other squinted at the girl and shook his head, as if the truth were an inconvenience. Michael watched their attention slide to the surface details, the way it always did when people decided they already knew how a story ended. He felt the girl's breathing hitch again, a shallow pause that stole seconds he could not afford, and he tried to pull their focus back to the only thing that mattered. He spoke calmly, evenly, choosing language that stripped away interpretation and left only facts. But the words hit a wall of skepticism that felt older than the night. Someone mentioned substances with a smirk. Someone joked about bad decisions made in cold weather. The laughter was not loud, not cruel in the way people expected cruelty to look. It was casual, the kind that assumed no consequences. Michael felt heat rise under his skin, not anger exactly, but a tightening, a narrowing. The return of something he had kept leashed for years. He watched the girl's eyelids flutter, her body shudder, and he saw the moment when her physiology crossed another invisible line. He tried once more, naming the change, naming the risk, pointing to her lips, her pulse, the way her muscles were beginning to fail her. The words landed and slid off. The decision was made without him. Metal touched his wrists, cold and final, the click loud in the quiet. Michael did not resist. Resistance too early only hardened people into their positions. He met the dog's eyes and felt the animal's confusion ripple through the bond they shared, felt the question there. "Not yet," he told it silently. "Not yet." He knelt as instructed, careful not to jar the girl as another pair of hands took her weight and did it badly, let her head loll in a way that made his stomach drop. He corrected them with his voice alone, sharp now, authority cutting through the momentary chaos, and they adjusted just enough to avoid disaster while continuing to treat him like a problem to be contained. The girl's breathing grew ragged, a wet edge creeping in that Michael recognized with a clarity that burned. He felt time accelerate, the way it did when margins vanished and only outcomes remained. He tested the cuffs with a small movement, mapping their give, the angle of the officer behind him, the distance to the other. He had not planned this. He had hoped it would not come to this. Hope, he reminded himself, was not a strategy. The girl convulsed then, a brief, violent shudder that snapped laughter into silence and forced the scene to reconfigure itself around the truth. Michael did not raise his voice. He spoke one sentence, measured and absolute, the way he had spoken on bad nights to men who needed to hear only one thing, now. When no one moved fast enough, when protocol continued to choke the moment, Michael made a decision that felt less like choice than gravity. He shifted his weight, rolled through the motion he had practiced 1,000 times without thinking, and brought one officer off balance with a controlled, efficient movement that ended with a weapon secured and pointed safely into the ground, his body positioned to shield the girl rather than threaten anyone. He did not feel triumphant. He felt tired. He felt the cost stack up in real time. He named the outcome he required with the same calm he had used all night, stripped of decoration, anchored to consequence, drive, hospital, now. The other officer froze, eyes flicking between the girl's seizing body and the weapon held down and away, understanding dawning too late and too completely. Michael felt the dog step closer, a quiet wall at his back, not aggressive, simply present, a reminder that this was not a standoff, but a line drawn around a life. Seconds passed that felt like hours. Then keys moved, doors opened, an engine revved with purpose instead of boredom. Michael released the officer the instant the decision was made, hands rising, weapon returned, the point proven without being pressed. He climbed into the back seat with the girl, guiding her head into a safer position, speaking her name over the roar of acceleration, counting again, structure against the tide. The road unspooled beneath them, lights streaking past, winter rushing in to fill the space where hesitation had been. Michael leaned close to the girl, voice steady, promising nothing he could not deliver, asking only that she stay with him a little longer. As the patrol car cut through the night toward the city, Michael felt the weight of what he had done settle fully at last. The knowledge that the forest had let him go only to hand him over to another kind of trial, one that would not be softened by snow or darkness. He watched the reflection of his own face in the glass and wondered not whether he would pay for this, but how much, and whether it would be enough to keep her breathing until they arrived. Fluorescent lights bleached the night at the hospital entrance, winter clinging to coats and breath while engines idle, and doors slide open with mechanical indifference. A place where urgency becomes procedure and time is counted in hands and monitors. Michael Carter felt the patrol car shudder to a stop, and then everything moved at once, doors opening, voices overlapping, a stretcher appearing as if summoned by need rather than protocol. And through it all he kept his hands where they were told to keep them, his attention fixed on the girl as she was lifted from his arms with a care that was finally competent and fast. He named what mattered again, not louder than before, just clearer, letting the facts stand without embellishment, as gloved hands checked airways and pupils and temperature, as someone nodded and said a word that meant they understood what they were seeing and why it mattered. The German shepherd stayed close, not in the way, but not retreating either, eyes tracking the girl as she disappeared through sliding doors, a low sound in its chest that Michael felt rather than heard, a question without language that asked whether the job was done or merely transformed. Michael did not answer it yet. He followed as far as he was allowed, and then the rules reasserted themselves, hands guiding him to a bench, cuffs still on his wrists, a line drawn where care ended and consequence began. He sat because sitting was what you did when you could no longer move the outcome with muscle or will, when the only work left was waiting and accepting the terms of that wait. The cold crept back into him as adrenaline drained, leaving behind the ache in his joints and the deeper ache of knowing that whatever happened next would be measured against the thing he had done in the woods and on the road, and whether the world would decide it was permitted. He watched the clock without reading it, counting breaths instead, counting heartbeats the way he had learned to do when nothing else was within his control. An officer he had not met before spoke to him briefly, neutral words delivered with the careful distance of someone who had seen too many nights like this and learned not to carry them home. Michael answered what was asked, and nothing more. He did not argue. He did not apologize. Apologies were for accidents. He had acted deliberately. Somewhere beyond the walls, a monitor chirped and then settled into a steadier rhythm, and Michael felt the smallest release inside his chest, the kind you did not celebrate because celebrating tempted fate. The German shepherd lay down at his feet, not exhausted, not defeated, simply present, a constant amid the reshuffling of authority and outcome. Michael rested his cuffed hands on his knees and waited. Time stretched, then compressed, then stretched again, elastic and cruel. A clinician appeared eventually, words brief and exact, confirming what Michael already knew and what he had been racing to make possible: poisoning consistent with winter mushrooms, advanced hypothermia avoided by minutes, seizures controlled, prognosis guarded but hopeful. Hopeful was not certainty, but it was a door that had not been closed. Michael nodded once and felt the weight shift from immediate crisis to deferred reckoning. The clinician left to do the work that mattered more than explanations, and Michael was alone again with the dog and the knowledge that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The questioning came later, measured and formal, cameras and reports and the careful language of institutions that needed to decide whether an exception could be made without breaking themselves. Michael told the same story again, not because repetition made it truer, but because consistency was its own proof. He described the forest, the hallucinations, the crushed caps beneath the snow, the seizures, the breath that went shallow at the wrong moment, the laughter that burned time they did not have. He did not dramatize. He did not minimize. He trusted the facts to stand on their own legs. The dog watched the people move and speak and write, sensing tension without understanding cause, loyalty untroubled by legality. Hours passed. Dawn threatened the edge of the sky with a thin gray promise. When the decision came, it did not arrive with ceremony. Cuffs were removed. Words were chosen carefully to say that there would be reviews and reports, and that nothing was decided yet, and that cooperation was appreciated. Michael accepted them without comment. He had never mistaken resolution for absolution. He walked out into the morning cold with the German shepherd at his side, the hospital doors closing behind them with the same indifferent efficiency they had opened, and he felt the night finally release its grip. Weeks later, he learned that the girl would recover, that the poison had been stopped before it finished its quiet work, that the cold had not taken what the forest and the road had threatened to claim. He learned it without fanfare, through a call that did not ask him for anything and did not offer him anything either, and he sat with the information until it settled into something like peace. He returned to the edge of Spokane where the trees began, and the city forgot itself, back to routines that did not ask him to explain who he was or what he had done. The German shepherd resumed its place in his days, steady and watchful, a partner in a life built from small, intentional choices. Michael knew there would be consequences that moved slowly and perhaps never fully resolved, files that would follow him, glances that would linger, the cost of having decided in a moment when indecision would have been safer. He accepted that too. He had not acted to be understood. He had acted to keep someone breathing. On a morning when the snow fell softly and the forest looked almost kind, Michael stood at the tree line and listened to the quiet he had chosen years ago. It was still there, disciplined and honest. The difference now was not in the world, but in him. He knew, with a certainty that did not require witnesses, that when the sound in the snow came again, as it always did in one form or another, he would answer it the same way, not because he sought redemption or recognition, but because some choices defined you, whether you named them or not, and he was willing to live with the cost of being that kind of man. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or light. They arrive as a tired person who refuses to walk away, as steady hands in the cold, as a choice made when no one is watching. If God still works in this world, He often works through ordinary people who choose compassion over safety, truth over convenience, and action over silence. In everyday life, we may never carry someone out of a frozen forest, but we all face moments when someone needs us to stay, to listen, and to act even when it costs us something, and that, too, is a miracle. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment with your thoughts or a prayer, and subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach the right hearts. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps, and may He watch over everyone listening today.